Artisans have been shaping fine metal into jewelry for thousands of years. Its beauty, pliability, and durability make it the perfect material for jewelry making. Learn how to solder metal to create rings like these today in Jewel School.
Hi, welcome to Jewel School. I'm Jose Silvera. I'm a metalsmith, teacher, and author. I've been metalsmithing for over 22 years. An important part of metalsmithing is the art of soldering. Today, I'll show you how to use a torch and solder to manipulate metal to create two wonderful artisan rings, including this hammered half-round ring and this revolving ring. When I teach my students how to solder, one thing they worry about using at home is a torch. And you need to use a torch to solder. You have to have that kind of heat. Now, with a few simple safety rules, you can work safely with a torch at home, especially a torch like this one. If you haven't recognized this already, it's a cooking torch. Use it to make creme brulee. If it's at home in your kitchen, it can be at home in your home studio too. Now, you want to make sure that you're safe and your room is safe whenever you're using a torch. To make yourself safe, you want to wear safety glasses. These are not safety glasses. These are my prescription glasses, and they're not made for the kind of things that can happen in a studio or when you're doing any sort of craft. So if you wear glasses like I do, wear prescription safety glasses. They're made to take it, and they have side shields, which normal glasses are missing. And they're a lot more comfortable. You also want to protect yourself by wearing natural clothing. You want to have cotton fibers on for your apron, for your shirt, for anything that might come in contact with a hot piece of metal. It's a good time to tie back any loose hair or clothing so that it just doesn't swing into the hot area. Now, I don't have a lot of hair issues, but if I had long hair, I'd tie it back and I'd clip any bangs that might hang down while I was leaning forward into the work area. Make sure that they don't swing down into that area. And it's not a good time to use hairspray or any flammable cosmetics. Not that kind of day. So you want to make sure that you're safe, and then you want to make sure that your entire home working environment is safe. Now, you might be just working at a regular kitchen table. To make sure that you don't leave any scorch marks on it, make sure that it doesn't get any burns, use a simple floor tile like this one. It's also important to protect your working environment from children and pets. Make sure they don't get into your tools when you're not around to supervise what's going on, and make sure that pets don't get up onto your work area. Just clean this area off when you're done. It's a good idea to have water on your work table. It takes care of most problems. You can use it to quench hot metal before it causes any problems, and you can also use it just in case there's like a small little bit of paper burning or something. Water is your best friend. It's always a good idea to have a fire extinguisher somewhere nearby. Of course, both with the fire extinguisher and your torches, it's a good idea to read and follow the instructions that come with them. Now, one of the things that you have to do safely with a torch is you have to refuel it. Most butane torches refuel in the same manner. They have a little fuel port on the bottom of the torch. It's easier to see if you take the stand off the bottom. There's a little recessed port right there where you put the fuel into. You want to make sure the torch itself is safe before you refuel. So if you've just been using it, this part here gets hot, so be careful of this. You want to make sure that's pointing away from you when you're refueling. Don't point it back in towards your skin. You want to make sure that the flame is completely out. There's no leftover flame here at the end. Turn the gas dial all the way down. Make sure the safety switch is locked on so that the torch can't light. You can tell usually by trying to push the trigger, and if you can't spark the torch, then a safety switch is on and it's safe. Torch is upside down. You take your butane canister. You want to make sure that the nozzle here on the butane canister is a good fit for your torch. Some butane canisters are for camping stoves, so you want to make sure you have the kind that fits butane torches. Safety glasses are on. You fit this to the bottom of your torch. Nozzle is pointed away from you. Hands are a little bit away from you. And you're going to depress strongly and firmly down to start the butane flow and to seal the connection. And now you're going to keep pressing until you see a big wet spray back like that. This one filled kind of quickly. It already has some fuel in it. But when it sprays really wet like that, the torch is full and done. Now, the butane evaporates very quickly. So even though you saw some butane liquid come out, already within seconds, it's evaporated off the torch and off of my hands. But you can always wipe it down with a towel if you're worried about it. Now, as soon as you're done refueling the torch, it likes to be upright on your table so that all the air bubbles can work their way up and out before you use it. And you should let it settle for 5 to 10 minutes. To keep your work area safe, you want to limit flammable objects that might be around while you're working with the torch. Here's a good one, butane. Your butane cylinder is very flammable. Keep this off the table at all times. Here's one you might not think about, a second butane torch. It's basically another cylinder full of butane waiting for an accident to happen. So just be safe. Use only one torch on the table at one time. Now, let's talk about some supplies that you'll need to make these rings. Let's review some of the supplies and tools you'll need to make these rings. Now, in the safety segment, we met the butane torches, and you need butane torches in order to get the solders for jewelry high enough in temperature for them to flow. There's two sizes here. There's a large flame and a micro butane torch. Now, basically you need two sizes just in case the material is so thick that you can't heat it up just with a small torch. So if that's the case, you can move to the bigger flame instead. The temperatures are the same between them. The only difference is the flame that comes out of the large flame torch is larger, more surface area. And that makes all the difference when you're trying to heat something up. You'll need some materials to make your rings. This is 10 gauge sterling silver wire that's half round in shape. And half round is a great shape for making rings, and especially for our first band. This is the band that you're going to learn the basics of ring craft on. So I have about a foot here of that. You'll also need some solder. This is hard solder. It's made from sterling. So this is made from precious metal to work on precious metals and base metals. Sterling solders come in hard, medium, and easy temperature. And hard, in jewelry talk, that means high temperature. So this melts at over 1400 degrees. You want your solder set up. We have the tile to protect the table. We have our solder board. This is the surface we're going to work directly on. When we're not working on this surface, which is a nice surface that can take the heat, we're going to work on the charcoal. And the reason you would switch from this surface to the charcoal is because it holds the heat longer and makes your butane torch better and more efficient. You'll also need some tools for moving the metal around while it's hot, like a titanium solder pick, a brush for applying flux, tweezers for picking up and moving around hot metal. You'll also need some flux, of course, because flux and soldering go hand in hand, and flux helps to keep your metal clean so that the solder will flow. Now let's take a look at some of the other tools that you're going to need just to form the ring and to polish it and work with it. So you need some tools that are going to support your work while you're doing filing and such, and to hold your work. So this tool is called a V-slot bench pen. And this is a V-slot bench pen that can clamp to your table. So this clamp, it goes through the back of the V-slot bench pen here like this. The top of it lays in the groove like that. And then you can clamp this C-clamp to your table. You'd want this right in your front work area here so that you can use it for filing, sawing, etc. And you can see this gets a little bit beat up so that your table doesn't have to. To hold your metal securely, a lot more securely than you can in just your fingers, you can use a ring clamp. This is a really old style tool, and it works with a wedge on one side and two choices of areas to clamp on it. But when you put the wedge in, it tightens whatever you're holding down so that you can file it, polish it, whatever you need to do. So it saves a lot on hand fatigue. You'll need some files. These are two sizes. This is a regular 6-inch half-round jewelry file. It's considered a medium cut. If you only have one file, it should be a medium cut. because that way it won't take you forever if you're using just a really fine file to do your work. So I use it with a handle. It makes it a lot more comfortable to hold when you're doing your work. This smaller file is called a needle file. They come in the same shapes as your larger files, but they're good for getting into hard to reach areas, like between the ends of the join when you're making the ring. So this file is a flat file. It has teeth on both sides so that you can sand on both sides of the join while you're getting it ready to solder. We have some tools for measuring. This is important because we need to measure the size of the ring blank to make our ring. And it has to be pretty accurate. So a simple tool you can have is just a ruler. The ruler has to have metric units on it. So this has centimeters and, more importantly, millimeters on there. The millimeters might be a little intimidating, but really they're very simple. There's just 10 millimeters to every centimeter. So for small stuff like jewelry, millimeters are much more handy than inches. If you have a choice and can have a digital caliper like this one, this will measure easily down to 1/10 of a millimeter. And that's important when you're making your ring blank. The ring blanks are measured to 1/10 of a millimeter. Now, when you open this thing up, you'll see the measurement on the dial. So it makes it very easy to know that you're at exactly the right measurement for your ring. And you'll need to be able to mark your metal where you need to cut it with a felt pen, just so you know what you're trying to do. Another device that you can use for measuring is a finger gauge, so you can figure out what your ring size is in the first place. So if you've been to a jewelry store, you know the routine. You just use these to measure your finger size, and the sizes are marked on them. If it has a whole number, that's the whole size. If it has a number and then a dash mark, for example, 11 minus, that means 11.5. We need some pliers, both cutters and benders, to do this kind of ring. So the flush cutters, the nicest you can use. These are really nice flush cutters. They'll cut a nice flat edge while you're working. And they should be durable enough and strong enough to cut through thicker gauge metals like 14 gauge. These are called flat half-round bending pliers. Sometimes just called half-round, sometimes called flat half-round, sometimes just called bending pliers, but they're always made of steel. One jaw is half-round, the other one is flat so that you can hold onto the metal and curve it and bend it, like when you're trying to close the ring for the join to be together for soldering. And we have some tools that you're going to use for forming the ring into a circle, one of which here is called a ring mandrel. This is a steel ring mandrel. You really can't do this with plastic or wood, too soft. The ones I like have sizes on the barrel here, so it shows you exactly what size the ring is when you put it on here and as you're working with it. You'll need a rawhide mallet. So this is made of coiled leather on the top here. And when you use a rawhide mallet, since it's the same hardness or softer than your metal, when you hit the metal, it just shapes and forms the metal. It doesn't actually forge it out or stretch it or make it larger. And that's important when you're just trying to bend the wire around the steel ring mandrel. We'll also need a steel hammer. We can use this to make texture on our metal, and we can also use it to stretch our ring up in size. So you'll want that steel hammer to be polished though. Don't want to just grab any hammer from around the house, because anything on here is going to imprint the soft jewelry metals that we use. So a flat face like this makes one texture, a rounded face like this makes another texture, and the polished surface here will shine up your metal while you're hammering with it, which is pretty great. You'll need a steel anvil, also called a steel bench block. I like this set because it comes with a little plastic disc that you can use to put on top of your material and then hit with a heavy hammer to flatten things in a really nice way. You've got your polished steel block here. Again, just like the hammer, anything on here will imprint your metal. So if there's big gouges and folds and wrinkles in the steel, it's going to make marks on your sterling. So this should be good quality, nice smooth surface on the top here. And having a rubber base like this helps to keep it from walking away from you while you're hammering on it, keeps it steady, and it lowers the noise so it's not so loud while you're working because it pads and muffles the sound. I have a water dish. So I have some water handy so that I can quench hot metal. Some sandpaper so that we can use that to sand the edges and inside the ring. So I have 180 grit, 320 grit, and 600 grit sandpaper. And these are wet or dry sandpaper used for metal. Finally, we have the pickle pot and pickle tongs for cleaning the metal after soldering. Pickle, which is the solution inside this basically crock pot. Pickle cleans your metal. It removes the flux and it removes any oxides that might form while you're working on it. Now the solution in here is a really mild acidic solution. It's a pool product, sodium bisulfate. The pool product that we use for jewelry making is called Sparex, and this is Sparex number 2. It's for non-ferrous metals. That's important. You want to get the one that works on copper, sterling, and metals like that. When you reach in there to get anything out, you want to use copper tongs. Never reach in with steel tweezers because it actually reverses the cleaning process and puts basically copper back onto your silver. So your silver looks pink when you take it out instead of nice and clean and white. So you always use pickle tongs. They're also longer for reaching into the solution so that you don't get it on your fingers. Again, it's mildly acidic, so if you get it on yourself or need to clean up anything, you can use a little water and baking soda to take care of that. And when you use the pickle pot, it's better because it heats the solution up to the point where it steams, and that just makes the pickle work faster. Now we're ready to get started with our first ring. Our first project is to make a simple half-round ring with a hammered texture. This is the example piece. It's about as basic as you can get for a ring, and yet it'll teach you all the basic skills to form and solder a ring. So the first thing we'll start with is figuring out our ring size, and then we're going to determine the length of metal that we're going to need to make that ring size, and then we will form the ring, we'll solder it shut, and then we'll hammer it and stretch it up to size with rawhide and steel hammers. Now, let's start with that finger sizing. You have 2 ways to figure out your finger size. Finger gauges, or you can use your ring mandrel and an existing ring. So with finger gauges, you try these rings on until you find the size that's most comfortable. You're looking for something that fits nicely on your finger. It still turns, but has a little bit of traction when it's going on over your knuckle. If you already have a ring that fits you and you're happy with the fit, you could check that size on the ring mandrel. Ring mandrels usually have sizes indicated on here, so it will measure the ring size on a ring. So the size marks on here are typically 1 here for the first size, so like size 10, and then it goes to a quarter size, a half size, a 3/4 size, and then the next size up, or size 11. So I'll take this ring here that I wear, and I slide it all the way down the ring mandrel until it's really tight and won't go any further. And where you want to measure is with the line basically in the center of the band. So in this case, this is stopped at 12.5. Line is right in the middle of the ring. So this is a size 12.5. So we need to figure out the length to cut the metal to make the size for our ring. Now I'm going to make a size 8 ring today. And you have to know the gauge of the metal so that you can figure out the length. Because the thicker the metal is, the more length you'll need to actually close it and make the same size ring. Now, to check the gauge of the metal, one tool you can use is the digital calipers. So when you turn on the digital caliper, you can hit the 0 button to make sure that it is zeroed out. And then you can open and hold the wire to check the size. So this is coming out as 1.3 millimeters. So that's the thickness. Don't be fooled by the gauge that you purchase it at, because if you go this way, that's the 10 gauge. We want the thickness, which is this direction. So now that I know that, I'm going to bring in my ring chart and find my length. So just get these soldering tools out of the way. And on this chart, which is called a ring blank size by metal gauge chart, I can cross-reference the gauge of the metal with the size of the ring. So in this case, I'm making a size 8 ring. And if I go across to the 1.3 column, I would find my size. So just quickly up here, the sizes up here, the thickness is in millimeters first, and then if there's a corresponding gauge, then that is in parentheses. So for example, 1.6 millimeters happens to be 14 gauge. So in this case, it's 1.3 millimeters, which happens to be 16 gauge. I just go down that column to the size 8 line, and my number would be 60.7. Now, that would be my number if I'm trying to make a smooth ring with no texture, and after I solder it, it's the right size after I reshape it. But if I want to add texture, if I want to hammer the ring and make those nice facets on it, that's going to make the ring bigger as I hammer it. So I need to actually start smaller so that I can forge the ring up as I texture it. So in that case, I would start at least a size smaller. You could even do a size and a half if you're going to add a lot of texture. But in this case, I'll start a size smaller. So I'll move from a size 8 to a size 7. So now my number would be 58.1 millimeters. So 58 millimeters and 1/10. The most accurate tool for measuring that is going to be the digital calipers. Again, start by zeroing that out, and then slide the caliper open. You want to take it up to where you get to the 50s here on the millimeter gauge, and then pass to 57, 58, and just futz with it a little bit till you're hovering right about at 58.1, like that. Then you can tighten that little knob down to hold the measurement. So now that should be exactly 58.1 millimeters. If you don't have a digital caliper, you can still do it on your ruler. What you want to do is just read the millimeters and estimate where it is between the mark. So if I go down the line here, every centimeter is 10 millimeters, so 40, 50, and then we get into a little simple section here where it's easy to count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then just a hair past the 58 mark to get 58.1. You're just estimating it to the best of your ability. Just keep in mind that you can't round it up and you can't round it down. If you do, it's a whole different ring size. It could be a quarter size up or down by just a few tenths of a millimeter off. So try to be as accurate as you can. When we go to cut this on the wire to make it the actual size, an important thing to do is to straighten the wire out so that you can lay it down flat. So I'm just straightening it with my fingers so I can lay it down flat for measuring like that. And you want to start with a flat end. You don't want beveled ends like this. So that's where the flush cutters come in. You can trim the end of the wire flat. When you do, just try to make it at a flat right angle cut. Put your finger over the end here, and you're using the flat flush side of the pliers. So you put your finger over the end so you catch a little bit that comes off. And there's our flat end for measuring. If we measured from the bevels, it would be inaccurate. You'd have a totally wrong size because you have to get rid of those bevels when you measure. So I'm just going to trim this wire a little bit shorter because the rest of it is in the way. Now I can lay this flat more easily. If I'm using the calipers, I can put that right on the flush end, and then I can use the sharp end down here to actually make a little bright scribe mark right where the measurement is. And if I can't see that, then I can come in with my felt pen and just mark that like so. Now, if you only have the ruler to do that with, then you would just line up the flat end of the wire to the ruler so it starts at the 0. And then you can make your measurement, 58.1. What do you know? It's in the same place. Now we can cut the other end flat as well. Take your time to make sure it's at a right angle, as close to your mark as possible. Hold the other end before you cut, and clip it with the flush cutters. You want to make sure that you cut flush on both sides so that each end of the blank is flat and flush. Now we're ready to file it and get it ready to form round into a ring. So now I'm going to move it to my bench pen. So I have my bench pen clamped to the table, and you might notice that I have some lines drawn on here. They're just lines that are put at right angles, just drawn with a little square so that I can kind of see what a right angle would be. So I'm hanging the end of the wire out here just a little bit, just a couple millimeters, so that I can use the straight side of the bench pen as a guide as I'm filing with this large file. So that's going to help me keep straight up and down. I don't want to be doing any of this motion because that's just going to round the join. So I keep it nice and straight here. And with a forward, upward stroke like this towards the tip, I'm filing the end flat and true. So it takes a little bit of practice, but it only takes a few strokes to make a nice, clean, flat end like that. Now we need to do the other side as well. So repeat the filing on the other side, lining it up, hanging it over the edge a little bit, filing with a nice straight up and down forward stroke with the file. Check your work. And now we can continue with the forming. So for that, I'm going to need the ring mandrel. I'm going to use my towel as a little cushion here. And I'm going to push back a little from the table so that I can rest the end of the mandrel there and the other end against my chest a little bit. And we're going to form this into a ring. Of course, I'm going to need the rawhide mallet. Okay. Now, we were at a size 7, so that's where I want to do my work. Now, I'm extending the end of the wire a little bit in air so that I can basically knock it down to the side of the mandrel, which will start rounding it. Using the rawhide, I won't alter the shape of it at all. I just hit it nice and firm, like that, to knock it down. Turn it over. Do the same thing on the other end. You always start with the ends first because they're the hardest to curl. Just keep pushing it out and knocking it down. When it gets a little bit awkward to hold, you can switch to the other side and keep forming it. Now, it doesn't have to be a perfectly round ring. We know that for this length, it should end up the right size if we solder it, right? We know that we cut it to about the right size to make it one size smaller. So at this point, it's round enough, and I can close it for soldering now. I'll need my bending pliers, my half-round bending pliers. And what I want to do is to bring the ends of the join down so that they're facing each other and flat and parallel. So that's definitely going to take it out around. So if I bring the ends together like this, you can see how they're going at an angle, right? They need to be parallel. So we take the flat half-round pliers, half-round jaw goes on the inside, flat on the outside, and you hold and bend. So you just hold gently but firmly, and just go ahead and bend it down like that. That's all you need to do. And when the ends are pointing at each other like this, then you're good to go. That's much better. And we can try the join now. We can see if it can close for soldering. So I hold it, and I'm going to overlap the ends like this. So one side and then the other side. That creates tension in the ring by kind of work hardening it a little bit until I get it to snap together and stay. So what I'm looking for now is how good the join is. I want to see a flat flush join from the top to the bottom, from end to end. So I can hold this up to a light and look through it and see if I see any gaps. If I see gaps in there because it's not touching well, I can either come in and readjust it slightly with the half-round pliers. So I could hold it like so. And just do little micro bends to adjust the fit. Or I might actually have to get in there and file it a little bit. If I think I need to file it, I'll want to use a smaller needle file and one that's flat, one that has teeth on both sides. I'll open the ring up so that it'll fit the file in between those ends. And I'll bring in the ring clamp to hold it. This makes the work much more steady and easy to control because you can definitely mess it up now by filing it incorrectly. You put the wedge in on the other side, and you can tap this on the table to make it nice and tight. And then it comes back to the bench pin, where you can slip the file between the ends of the join and do a little short, controlled filing.
Then flip the ring clamp around and file the other side.
When it looks like it's just about ready, I can take the wedge out. You rock the wedge sideways to take it out easily. So it's in like that, nice and tight, just rock it sideways. Take it out. And try closing it again. Side to side, and then a little bit back and forth to get it to settle. Looking good. I'm going to make a couple of little micro tweaks, like so. just to line it up as straight as possible. And now we're ready to solder it. Soldering, its basic definition, is that you're using a metal that melts at a lower temperature to close the ring. So solder itself is alloyed to melt before your metal does. Even if it's high, hard temperature solder, it melts before the sterling does. There's 5 things you need to do in order to solder effectively and correctly. So you can remember them by thinking of your hand. So if you look at your hand, you can remember the 5 steps. The first step is that the metal must be clean, then the joint must be closed, you must have flux, you must have solder, and you must have heat. You need all those things to make solder work. So the metal is clean, it's brand new, we just got it, and in fact, we just cut it and filed it. And that's the best state the metal can be in. So if it's covered in a lot of tarnish or dirt, that can interfere with soldering. The joint is closed. That's what we just spent a whole bunch of time working on, is closing that joint nice and tight. It must be closed with the ends touching for the solder to be pulled in. Basically, when it's touching, you actually get this little tiny vacuum at the joint. It's a capillary action that will draw the molten solder through the joint and into the metal and across to the other side. It bonds so strongly that you end up getting this really tight molecular hold that lets you stretch that ring with a hammer up to 2 sizes larger. That's pretty amazing. But if you don't have a good joint to start with, it's going to break on you while you're doing that. So it must be tightly closed. The third thing is the flux. And we've mentioned that the flux is used to keep your metal clean. Flux is made from borax, water, and sometimes some other additives like fluoride. When you're working with flux, this is why you want a little towel handy so that you can wipe your hands. The borax is the main component here. This is what keeps the metal clean while you're working. And the flux needs to be in a proper consistency. So it shouldn't be really pasty. Even though they call it paste flux, it should be creamier, more like that. And you can thin the flux down with water. Flux is poisonous, unfortunately, mildly poisonous, so you need to not eat while you're working or touch your face, and you can't absorb it through your skin. So when you're holding metal, a lot of times I'll see beginners hold their metal to flux with their fingers, and then they're just applying the flux and they're getting it on their skin, which is not good, because you absorb the flux through your skin, and just like any craft chemical you're working with, you want to play nice with it. So instead, hold it with tweezers. It's much better anyway. And then you can flux the ring. Now, you want to flux the entire ring because you want to keep the entire ring clean while you're soldering. Any metal that's exposed to the air while you're heating it up to these high temperatures will get what's called fire scale on it. It's a high temperature oxide that forms. It basically brings the copper that's in the sterling up to the surface, and it darkens the sterling. It makes it really blotchy looking and changes the color. If you use flux, it acts as a barrier to keep that clean. So don't just use it at the joint, actually use it on the whole piece. And we'll see as we solder more and more, there's a lot of times where we're basically referring to how to use the flux to make the solder work. So first thing is that you always flux the entire piece. When you lay it down on the charcoal block, go ahead and lay that down with the ring facing you, with the joint facing you this way. Now we're going to cut the solder. So I have my hard solder, and I can tell it's hard solder because it has 3 bends on the end. The more bends, the higher the temperature. 1 bend easy, 2 bends medium, 3 bends hard. I'm going to trim a little piece off the end here. It should be about 1 millimeter long. Whether it's been flattened or straight, doesn't matter, so about 1 millimeter like that. And you can put your finger over the tip and cut. Now I'll show you a little trick for measuring the wire. So we'll move a little bit further down here and cut it where it's straighter and more like original wire. And after you make a cut, there's always little bevels left behind. Little sharp angles from the last cut. So we can use that for our measurement. If you take the flat flush side towards the tip you're going to cut off, towards the little piece you're going to cut off, you can kind of put the flat part of the pliers just a little bit below the bevels, and that's about 1 millimeter. Take your finger from the plier hand and put it over the tip and turn and cut to catch the piece, which is very small, and put it down. So the big lesson there is it does not take a lot of solder to close this ring. Only just a couple of pieces, maybe this size. You can even get it done with just 1. You put it on your solder board, and you'll need to use flux again. Because the solder itself is made from sterling, so it could get oxides, called fire scale, before you even get it to the job. And those oxides will prevent soldering from happening. So we dab a little bit of flux on each piece. If it picks up on your brush, don't worry about it. Just scrape it back against the board like that. And now our solder is prepared. We need to apply the solder and then heat the ring to make it fill the joint. This is where the pick comes in. And the torch. Now, we're going to go over how to light the torch so that you see how to light this properly. A lot of butane torches work in the same manner. You've got a gas switch on the side here, which shows you how much gas you're putting out. So the further towards the flame, the further towards plus, the bigger the flame is going to be. So I'm going to put this about midway. And a safety switch here under the trigger. And then there is the locking switch on this side here that you can use to lock the torch on and then turn it off. So gas is halfway. I pull the safety switch down. Whenever you light the torch, light it towards your safe material, the solder board, the charcoal block, those kind of things. Don't turn and point it towards your tabletop or towel or anything like that. These can take it. Hit the trigger. If it lights, great. If you let go of the trigger, you turned it off. And you have to pull the safety switch down again. And keep hitting the sparker with that hard click until it lights. Then you can pull that safety switch back towards you. That locks it on. You can let go of the trigger. And now the torch is working. Now, if anything goes wrong, the first thing you should do is turn it off. To turn it off, the trigger doesn't work anymore. So you go back to the locking switch and you push that forward. That turns off the torch. Safety down, pop the igniter, lock it, and now it's ready to go. And halfway for this ring is good to get started. Now with a little bit of heat, I can lightly warm the solder and use that to kind of pick up the solder against the pick. So let me show you that again. In fact, you can even let the solder roll up. So if I heat the solder until it rolls into a little ball and then take the heat aside, I can scoop it up on the end of the pick. And the combination of the heat and the flux will make it stick. Now we're going to bring the heat to the ring. And we're going to start by warming the flux. And we're looking for it to go white like that. That means it's coating the entire piece, and then it starts to bubble and turn clear. And as it's turning clear, it's becoming tacky. And I'm going to hold the heat by kind of simmering on and off like this while I set that down on the join line. So this flux is tacky, so it takes it from the pick to the ring. You need to be warming the ring to get it to go to the metal. Start by warming in the back because silver is a really good conductor, so you need to warm the back part of the ring first. Then bring your heat to the front as it becomes more clear and just hold it up and down the join line like that until the solder flows just like that, about when the metal is turning a nice red. As soon as you see it flow in, you can take the torch off. If you feel like it might not have gone through all the way, you can flip it over like I just did. Scoop up a second piece of solder. Place that again by lightly warming it as you test the fit, like that. Go ahead and heat in the back again, and then bring the heat repeatedly to the front until you see it flow like so. When you're done, take your tweezers, pick it up. Now, if you wait too long, it will actually stick to the block. The flux will cement it down. So if you pry it, you're going to take big chunks of charcoal with it. So if you don't want that to happen, turn on your torch, lightly warm it to loosen the flux as you nudge it with the tweezers, and then you can pick it up without bringing big chunks of charcoal with it. If you do, the charcoal will come off in the pickle anyway. First stop for this little guy is water. I'm going to take it over to my quenching pot here and put it in the water. You don't want to stick it right into the pickle when it's hot because that'll spray pickle into the air. Then we can take it to the pickle pot. Remember, steel does not go into the pickle. So you can drop it in, but when you take it out, you have to use the copper tongs. And we let it soak in there for 5 to 10 minutes to take the flux off and any of the scale that might have come up to the surface during soldering so that it's nice and clean and ready for forming. After the ring is pickled, we want to rinse it off in some water. So I'm going to move my water cup closer to the pickle pot. Remember to use your copper tongs to reach in. Don't use steel. Grab the ring and we'll rinse it off. You want to rinse all the pickle off so that you don't get it when you're soldering. It'll interfere with soldering. And you also want to make sure the ring is dry before you start using any steel tools. Otherwise they'll rust. That's why I don't use pliers to hold my metal when I'm fluxing, quenching, or anything like that. I use tweezers because I like my pliers. So now let's make this round and a ring again. I'm going to grab the ring mandrel. I'm going to find a dry part of the towel here just as a little cushion. And we'll put that ring on here. It's nowhere near size yet. It's pretty close, but it needs to be rounded. So we'll use the rawhide mallet to form it around. My fingers are in back so that I can slide it down a little bit as I'm working. As it gets rounder, it's going to move down the mandrel. So we start hitting. And as it stops, you can see it's stopping on the 7 line with the line right in the middle. So size 7, like we measured. Now, let's pretend I actually wanted this to be a little bit bigger. Like I wanted to stretch the ring without hammering it and making texture on it. I could use the rawhide mallet to make it a little bit bigger right now by just stretching it up the ring mandrel. So let's say I want to get it to a 7.5. Instead of hitting flat to the ring like so, what I can do instead is hit downwards like this. And that's moving the ring down the mandrel. When it gets a little bit stuck and you've gone around a couple times, put your finger ahead of it and knock it off. I like to, before I do that, just make it round again and then knock it forward to loosen it and reverse it. We'll go ahead and just take this to a 1/4 size larger, and then I'll show you how we can make it bigger with the steel hammer even faster. So I'm going to loosen it off and flip it over. Traditionally, you go around the ring a couple times and then you reverse it so that you're working evenly on it, so that the ring is the same size on both sides when you wear it or when you measure it. Now, if we switch to a steel hammer and texture this with the steel hammer, it's going to get even larger. So now we're taking it towards the size 8. I'm going to use the rounded side of this forming hammer to make some nice polished hammer marks on the ring. Same technique, bigger, stronger hammer. Now, since I started a little bit further up, it's slightly larger than the size 8, but you can see it went basically a size larger by the time I finished going around once. If you still wanted to add more texture, we could actually keep going, make the ring bigger, and then cut it and make it smaller again by resoldering it. So for example, I could hit a little bit more along this edge. Take it off, do the other side. And when I'm satisfied with the texture, just kind of get a reading on the size. It looks like it's just about a size 8.5. So I can make this smaller now by actually cutting it and reducing it in size by removing a little bit of material. Before I do that, I grab my steel bench block, and the ring has gotten a little bit wobbled from all that hammering. So I want to straighten it out first with the rawhide. Another way you can do that is you can take the plastic disc, put it on top, and hit it with your steel hammer. and flip it over. So it gives you a little bit more weight and distributes the blow and makes it nice and flat. So now I can refine the join. Let's bring it back over here. So the join is right here on the edge of the ring. And I could remove a little bit of material. I can start by cutting that open on the join line, overlap it, and the simplest way as a beginner is just to put it back on the ring mandrel and just overlap it a little bit smaller than the size you want it to be and remove that amount. You can always make it just slightly smaller than what you think it would be if you were trying to cut it exactly, because you know now that you can stretch it back up to the right size, so you won't get rid of any of the texture. So now we cut the other side flush again. So make sure you've got the flush side facing the right way and catch a little bit of metal. And then basically we could solder that again. The cool thing is when you resolder it, the metal will go dead soft again, and you'll be able to reform it without having to deal with all the work hardening that happened from the texture. Now we've learned the basic principles of making a ring with this half-round project. In the next project, we're going to use the same principles and add on some new skills to make a revolving ring. In this project, we're going to apply the principles that we learned in the basic ring, the half-round hammered ring, to make another ring, this time a ring that revolves. This has a second ring that revolves over the first, making it a revolving ring. You flare the sides to keep this second ring in, but you get to make two rings this time. So to make this, you're going to need a few more tools and some different supplies. Let's check out the materials first. In addition to the hard solder that you used the first time, which has 3 bends in it to indicate that it's hard solder, you want to use medium solder as well. This has 2 bends in the end to show that it's medium sterling solder. Now you have to add these marks yourself, they don't come that way. So whatever system you use, make sure that you're clear as to what they mean so you can identify your solder. We're also going to need some sterling 20 gauge sheet, dead soft, to make the band with. We'll need some gold-filled, half-round, 10 gauge dead soft wire. We'll use this to make the spinning revolving ring. Now you have an option, because the gold-filled has gold tone and sterling solder has a silver tone, you may want to use a matching solder to make the solder seam disappear. It's a little bit more expensive, but if you use 12 karat or 14 karat yellow easy solder, you can match the tone of the gold-filled and make the join almost invisible. In addition to the basic set of tools, we're going to want some different ones like these. We are going to need dividers. The dividers will allow us to scribe parallel lines so that we can make a wider strip of metal to make our ring blank from. And we're going to need dapping punches. These cool dapping punches will allow us to flare the sides of the ring. You want the size of the dapping punch to be a little bit wider than the ring itself so that it'll flare out the sides. You'll need something to hit those dapping punches with. So I recommend a 1-pound brass mallet like this one, or you can even use an 8-ounce or 16-ounce ball peen hammer that you might have around the house with an unpolished finish. You'll also need some shears, some straight shears, also called French shears, so that you can cut out your metal, and these will cut through 20 gauge, which is nice, so it avoids having to saw. So we're going to get started with the inside band, the wide band for the ring, and we are going to determine the width that we want the strip to be for the ring blank. So you can see this is wider. You get to decide how wide you want it to be. So you can do 10 millimeters, 8 millimeters, 5 millimeters. I recommend that you compromise and you do about 8 millimeters. And to scribe it on the sheet metal, you're going to use dividers. This will make a nice parallel line for you to follow with the shears. You can open and close these with the locking nut, and you can use your ruler to set it to the size you want. So I set this on the millimeter line, and I'm going to open and close the jaw until it sits at 8 millimeters. In fact, one little trick is to have one leg just outside 8 millimeters, since you're going to use the straight edge of the sheet metal as a guide, like this. This edge is nice and straight here. It's an original cut. I can use that to follow along as I scribe a line on the sheet metal. So now I'm going to press down on the left leg, and as I do that, it scribes and burnishes a little bright line for me to follow that's exactly parallel to the outside edge. And that's 8 millimeters wide. Now I'll take the shears and I'll cut this out. So they work just like scissors. Just make sure that your fingers are not right in front of the shears while you're cutting. Takes a little bit more pressure, but just go slow and try to cut as true to the line as possible. My tip would be to cut just outside the line so that you can see it when you're done to evaluate how straight you were. Now, after cutting the sheet metal, it's pretty crooked. It's twisted this way, and it's even twisted a little bit sideways, so we have to straighten it out. I'm going to need my bench block for that, and I'm going to need my rawhide mallet. Since I don't want to do any texture or forging of the metal, I just want to shape it. We'll start by flattening it out first. It's easier to flatten something when it's humped up rather than with the ends going up like that. So easier humped up than with the ends up. So turn it like that and start knocking it down. You keep flipping it over, basically looking for those little humps of air and knocking them flat. Okay, now that it's sitting a little bit flatter, we can start addressing the other issue, which is that it's crooked going this way. And you can see that if I set it on the block, you can see there's some air underneath it. To fix that, I'll hammer along the ridge of the sheet metal. I'll do this in short sections rather than trying to do the whole thing at once. And turn to flatten. Next section. I love doing this with metal. That's why I don't do wood. It's very hard to do this with a piece of wood. So, nice and flat and straight. We are going to measure the length on this now to make our ring. Now, in the first project, we showed how to use the ring chart to get your length by the gauge. So I'm going to make a size 7 ring, and this is 20 gauge now, so you need to use a different column on the ring chart. So you want to find the column that has the 20 in parentheses. And if you go down that column and you go across, you'll see that for 20 gauge, to get the right length for that size, it's 56.5 millimeters. And I've already set my digital calipers to that length. Before you start measuring, of course, you want to make sure that the end you're starting from has a nice, straight, right-angle cut. You don't want to start measuring from an angled cut, because then you're just going to have to correct it later, and the ring blank will end up shorter. So this end here looks pretty decent. I'll set the digital calipers on one end, and then I'm going to use the sharp ends of the calipers just to scribe a little line. Now that can be hard to see, so I'll come back in with my felt pen, and I will shade that in a little bit so I see what I have to remove. Back to the shears. And then we can line those up and cut it. Save your little bits of metal, they're worth money. Now, we want to file those ends to make sure they're at a right angle straight across. We do the best we can with cutting, but you make it better with filing. So we're going to move to the bench pin. We're going to take advantage of those straight lines on here again at a right angle. Set this just a little bit off the edge. You can even use the scribe line you made as a little bit of a guide if it's still there. And we'll file to a right angle. Time to form it into a ring. Back to the ring mandrel. Use the towel as a cushion again. I want to work with the size 7 area here, and I want the rawhide mallet, and we're going to use this to form it around. So just like before, you extend it a little bit in air, maybe a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, and knock it down to the mandrel. Now, let's take a look at it. Nice and round. Doesn't have to be perfect. Same thing as with the half-round ring. We know that it's about the right length. Now we're just concerned with closing it for soldering. We'll need our flat half-round bending pliers. Half-round jaw goes on the inside, flat on the outside. And you're going to just hold firmly and bend. And grab and hold and bend. It's a little tougher than the half-round wire, but you've got the leverage to do it. But if you're having difficulty doing this bend because you don't have the hand strength to do it, I'm going to show you a little trick. We can move back to the bench block. We can set up the ring on the bench block like this. You can take your rawhide mallet, and you can use that to tap these ends down. So you're allowing the strength of the ring itself to help you slow it down while you tap these closer together, like this. That'll work great on thicker gauge metal too. So now we need to evaluate the join to make sure that it's good for soldering. It's a bigger join line, and it needs to be flush from top to bottom. If it's not, then it won't fill and it'll be there really obvious when you finish soldering. So we want to try to get rid of it by filling it up with solder. And again, solder works when the joint is closed and flush and complete. It doesn't like to fill gaps. So we need to do the best job we can here. So taking a look at this, I think it could use a little bit of filing. So I'm going to bring it over here to my filing station with the bench pin and find my ring clamp. I'll open this just wide enough for the file. In fact, I'll grab that flat needle file. I'm going to stick it in there so that basically the ring clamps onto it like that. Then I can hold it on the flat side of the ring clamp. I want the join to be in the middle and centered. And the needle file should basically rest on the flat surface of the ring clamp. Now I'll keep that in place while I put the wedge in and tap it down. All right. Now, since this is keeping everything really parallel, I can just do little short file strokes that'll almost file both sides at the same time. And do a little bit on each side, and then check your work. To close the ring, we're going to need to overlap the ends. Only it's going to be too hard to go side to side on this. So we're going to overlap them top to bottom. Like that, and like that. Top and bottom. You can see that's starting to create tension in the ring so that it snaps together with pressure. So just a little bit of adjustment side by side. And again, if you need a little bit more help with leverage, if you've gotten it close but the ends are a little bit out of alignment, you can use the flat half-round pliers to bend it and tweak it. So taking a look at it from the top here, I can reach in with these guys, take a grip on one side near the join line, and give it a little bend. I'm just using this to line up the join with gentle pressure so that it's nice and even from one end to the other. The better it looks now, the better it will solder. Speaking of which, I think we're ready to solder it now. Let's bring back our soldering setup. And we have to go through the same 5 steps again. The ring is clean, the join is closed. Now we have to put on flux. Hold it with your tweezers and flux it inside and out. Now before I start up the torch, I want my solder ready to go. And I'll show you a cool little way to do the solder that might be a little bit easier for you too. So there's always more than one way to apply solder. So this method is going to take a little bit of hammering. So I'm going to push this aside. Never put your bench block on top of your tile and do any hammering because you won't have a tile for very long if you do. Take your steel hammer. This is the hard solder. And I'm going to hammer out the last ½ inch of this so it's flat like sheet metal. Now it's nice and thin, and it looks like a little piece of sheet. The reason I did that is because if it's flat like that, I can actually put the solder under the join and let the weight of the ring pin it down and keep it in place. It can be a little bit easier for beginners to apply solder that way. So we bring out our flush cutters, and we're going to need to cut some of this. So I'm going to cut a piece that's about 2 millimeters long. For this width, it looks like a little square. Put your finger over the tip, turn and cut, and set that down on your solder board. And I like to have a couple pieces ready to go just so I don't have to stop in case I decide I need another one. So another equal size piece, and a third one just for luck because you never know. Set that aside. Okay. Just like before, you need to apply a little bit of flux to your solder. It's made mostly of sterling, remember, so if it is exposed, it will come off. Now, if it gets stuck in your brush like this, it might be easier to come in and use your pick to squeegee it out like that. There it is. And then set it down on your board. Stubborn little piece. Now, we can get this a little bit wetter so it doesn't stick so well, like that. Much better. Now, we need to apply the solder. Now, you can use your tweezers or you can even just use your brush to pick up the piece of solder and place it on your charcoal block. Where you place it should be nice and flat. So I'm just going to move this in a little bit and set it down. I want the join line facing me so I can see what's going on here. And I'm going to pick up the ring, and I'm just going to position the join line right on top of that piece of solder. Solder will flow up, down, sideways. As long as it's touching the join line, it'll be pulled up and through. All right, now, since this is a big ring, I'm just going to stand by with the flux brush just in case some of the flux peels off. We'll start up the torch. Definitely, the larger flame torch will be good for this ring because it's a bigger surface area to work with. And I'm just starting with a low heat, almost using the torch like a hair dryer, just to lightly warm the flux and get all the water to evaporate so I can evaluate how well it's sticking. So you can see here how it's turned white and powdery, but I'm missing flux in these areas. And it's nice and hot, so as I put the flux on, it just sizzles the water right out.
Continue applying flux, warming the ring as you go to make sure the flux sticks.
All right, time to move that solder into place. Going to increase the heat. And as I warm this up, I'm going to make sure that the solder has stayed pinned under the ring. So as you heat it up, it's nice to see all this surface area. You can really see the stages of the flux, how it's going kind of gooey, and now it's starting to clear. So it clears at about 1100 degrees. You want to keep warming the entire ring, nice and slow, kind of heating a little bit more to the back. And now as it gets very clear, I'm going to start moving the heat up and down the join line, nice and even. Just watching for the solder to jump up and in, a little bit in back, a little bit in front. And there it goes, up and through. Beautiful. Pick it up while it's still hot and quench it in your water. Now, from the water, it goes into the pickle. Remember that you don't want to put your steel tweezers in the pickle, so just drop it from outside and let that soak for a good 10 minutes, and then you're ready to keep going. Let's check on the ring and see if it's done pickling. Ah, looks good. Looks like all the flux is off of it, and we've rinsed it off so we don't have any pickle left on it. And as I'm drying it off here, I'm going to check the join to make sure that it's complete. It looks good inside and out. Full from end to end. So now we can put it on the ring mandrel and straighten it into a round ring.
Just like before, use the rawhide hammer to round the ring.
Now, you could keep this untextured and keep it just like this and keep going with the ring. You can polish off the join line, and then you can flare the sides after you put the gold-filled ring on and make a revolving ring, and you'd have a nice contrast between the two colors. If you want to add some texture to it, you can increase the size a little bit as you do it with a steel hammer. Now I'm just going to stretch this a little bit further down the mandrel. But with a wideband ring like this, it's definitely easier to do your stretching with the steel hammer. So that's going to put texture on it anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and do that because I think it's going to look really pretty. So let's see. We're going to grab the steel hammer, and we'll use this rounded side here. Start with the join line, and we'll planish it and make some beautiful hammer marks. Now, as I'm hammering, I'm working from the middle of the band down towards the side nearest to me, down towards the side, towards the thick end of the ring mandrel. And that's because this is where the ring is really flush to the steel. If I hammer too much on the other end, where it's thinner, I'll actually shrink the size of the ring on that size and cone it. So I want to keep the ring even on both sides, so I'm going to work just on this side, flip it over, and then do the other side. Now you want to make sure that the ring is an even size from either direction. So when you take it off, flip it over, check the size, that's about a 7 3/4. Flip it over, about a 7 3/4 again. So it looks even from both directions, and the texture is complete as well. If you knew from the beginning that you'd want to do some texture, then when you started, just go ahead and start like a size smaller. Right? Start a size smaller, and then you can work your way up to the bigger size. So you can see it grew like a size when I added the texture after the fact. So let's bring it back over here. We'll set it on the block, and we can put the plastic disc on top and hit it to even it out. This isn't flaring it yet. This is just making it flat and even. We want those edges to look nice. So we're going to bring in some sandpaper and sand the edges flat. Now when you're sanding to make a nice flat surface, make sure there's no bumps on your tabletop. Make sure that's nice and smooth. Any bumps under there will translate to weird bumps on your sanding. And then you can run the ring back and forth like that. And every so often turn it 180 degrees on the same side, and then do a quarter turn, and then 180 degrees again, so that you sand it from all directions, so that you don't end up tapering your ring now. But that will make the sides start to flatten and look pretty. So I'm going to do a little bit more sanding, and then we'll be ready to make the second ring for this project, which is the gold-filled ring. As I'm finishing the sanding, I'm going to mention that since we know this is now a size 7 3/4, in order for the gold-filled ring to fit over this, I know from experience that it usually has to be about 2.5 sizes larger to fit over it and still rotate. If it's too small, it won't fit over the edges of the ring, or it might fit so snugly that it won't revolve at all. So 2.5 sizes larger. All right, so we need the half-round wire. We're going to use this to make our second ring that's going to go over the first. It's 2.5 sizes larger, but it's a different thickness. Remember, this is 1.3 millimeters thick, so it's a different column on the ring sizing chart. So I checked the measurement, and it's 64.4 millimeters long, and it's basically a size 9.5. So we're going to do our measurement again. So I'll grab our digital calipers, which are so accurate, and we'll open this up to 64 and 4/10 within a couple hundredths of a millimeter, like that. Now we have our measurement. This is really similar to doing the basic ring, except that now you're working in gold-filled. A lot of people, when they learn to solder, they're very interested in working in gold-filled because it's a really affordable alternative to working in gold. And when you solder it shut, it's seamless. So you can't tell that there's a core of other metal on the inside because you've completely closed it. So we'll lay this down, and we're going to take our measurement from the end and scribe a little line where we need to cut it again, like so. And cut our second time. Now we have our two flat flush ends, and we'll form this up into a ring. Of course, I'm going to just stop for 1 second and file it over here while I've got the opportunity to dress the ends before it's curled around. Looks good. Ring mandrel, rawhide mallet. I'm sure this is sounding familiar by now. And here we go. This is going to be a size 9.5. So we start curling the ends. And curl the rest of the ring. Nice and round. Next step is the flat half-round pliers to curl these ends in so that they're parallel and lined up for soldering. Side to side to create tension. And bring back the pliers just to do a little micro bend to finish lining it up. Ready to solder. Back comes the soldering stuff. Use the same flux, and in this case we're using the same solder, only we're going to use a slightly lower temperature. And that's because gold-filled can have a lower melting point than sterling silver. So if you use high temperature solder, there's a chance you could melt it a little bit. So instead of using hard, I'm going to use medium solder, which is lower in temperature. I can tell it's medium because it has the two bends. Flush cutters, and we're back to the small 1 millimeter chips, in other words, just a little bit below the bevels on from the last cut on the wire. And I'm going to move it to a slightly different location just so I know that I'm dealing with the medium solder.
I like to mark around the area to separate the medium from the hard solder.
So I'm going to cut one more piece just in case I need it and put it there. And now we can go back to fluxing. So the ring is clean, the join is closed. We're going to put flux on the whole thing. Even though this is a different material, gold-filled still has base metal inside of it, so it has copper inside of the metal. And if you don't protect it while you're soldering, you can bring that copper up to the surface. Only things are a little bit worse now because you only have a thin layer of gold on top. If you put on too much fire scale, you'll polish right through that layer of gold and down into the base metal. So you want to make sure it's protected with flux. Quick note here, you cannot solder things that are plated. So you can't do a vermeil ring or a silver plated ring, it won't work. It'll burn the plating right off. All right, I'm just looking for my pick, which has gone astray. And I've got my solder there and the torch. We're ready to go. So I'm going to heat up the solder. I just noticed I forgot to put a little bit of flux on there, so I'm just going to dip a little bit on, heat it up, and scoop. And then go ahead and start heating the ring. Now that you know about checking the flux, you can see how I'm picking up the brush first to make sure that I cover any little stray areas. All right, so now we're going to start with a gentle heating of the whole ring. It's not difficult to solder gold-filled stuff. You just want to bring your best skills to the soldering. So nice, even heat. When this turns clear, you can drop your solder off on the join line like that. Take the heat right down the middle. We'll scrape that over a little bit as it starts to flow. And into the join. Good. As soon as you see the solder flow, you're done. Into the water. And then into the pickle for another 5 minutes. All right, let's check on our ring and the pickle. If everything goes well, that's our last soldering for this ring. Looks good so far. Nice gold color. And the join looks completely soldered. Since we use sterling solder, there's a little bit of silver tone at the join, but when we polish, we'll minimize that so it's just on the join line. So with a little bit of polish too, it'll be distracted by the bright finish. You won't see it as well. All right, time to get this little guy round again. So we're going to use the ring mandrel and the rawhide mallet. Now it's a size 9.5. We're going to check the fit and make sure that it goes over the first ring. Oh, it's close. We have to go just a little bit more to get over that edge. Just got to go a little bit further than that. That's why it's art and not science. All right, so we're going to put this on here and stretch it up a little bit further. Well, I'm going to add some texture to it so that it really goes up a little bit more. Nothing wrong with a little bit of texture. It's very pretty. Right, let's try the fit now. No problem. Right over the ring. Okay, so we're going to flare one side, and then we'll do a little bit of polishing on this, and then we'll flare the second side. So let's flare one side first. Wide band on the steel block. We need one of our dapping punches. We're going to tap this straight down and in to flare the edges over. I'm just turning the ring every so often to try and get a nice even flare. You can kind of tilt the punch a little bit. Flare more on one side. You can also try a different punch to see if that evens it out a little bit more. All right, that looks like it has a nice flare on it. Let's put the ring on there. And that'll stay on nicely. Okay, now it's easier when they're apart to do all of my polishing, so I'm going to go ahead and set up to polish these two rings. For polishing, I've set up a flex shaft here so that we can use this flex shaft motor and some polishing bits to polish our rings before we put them together. Now, a flex shaft is like a jeweler's Dremel. And if you had a Dremel tool, you could use that instead, but a flex shaft is a much better tool. It has a better motor, has a nice, strong, flexible shaft, and a really comfortable handpiece. And best of all, it works with a foot pedal. So you don't have to reach up to turn on any power switches while you're working with it. The way you open and close the flex shaft is with a chuck key. You'll see on the gears here, there's a little hole, and you insert the chuck into that hole, and then you can turn it to open and close it. Left to loosen, right to tighten. So let's open it up a little bit, and we can insert our first bit. So as I use the bits, I'll introduce them to you. This first bit here is called the split mandrel, and it's your least expensive bit that you can work with. It's just a steel cylinder that has a nice little slot in it, and we can use it with sandpaper. You load it in. You want the base of the split mandrel to be nice and low, touching the chuck keys if you can. Sometimes they're a little long, so you might have to trim them with a saw so that they fit like this. Now, this works with sandpaper. This is the same sandpaper that you used for sanding the sides of the ring, only now I've cut it into 1" by 4" strips. This is 320 grit sandpaper. You can load it into the split mandrel. You want the long side on the left, sandpaper side facing you, short end on the right. When you turn on the tool, it's going to wind itself around. And it'll form a little drum. So I'm going to take the big ring first, turn it on, and put it inside. Now, when you press down with the split mandrel, you'll see it tightens up into a little drum. You don't want it up in the air like this where it's flapping around. And if you can hear by the motor, this is low speed, so I'm trying to hold the foot pedal where it's not really high, like this would be too fast. Low speed. You always want to be looking at the part that you're sanding. So inside the ring here, I'm sanding the lower part, not the top part up here. And when you've gone all the way around, flip the ring over, and work the other side. All right, now we're going to switch tools for a second, and I'm going to do a little bit of work on the join. Let's see, we got our chuck key, so we loosen this to the left. And I'm going to use a tool called a silicone polishing wheel. You can either use a white silicone polishing wheel or a black silicone polishing wheel. The white one is coarse, and the black one is medium. So if your join line doesn't look too deep, you could just as easily use the black one and not put coarse sanding lines into your piece. So I'll use the medium grit. Again, it's better with power tools to try to use the finest grit you can start with, rather than always starting with the coarsest bit. That way you can save yourself some time. We'll find that join line, which looks pretty decent. Okay, and we'll just polish that off. So these polishing wheels could be an alternative to using the sandpaper. They're made of solid abrasive, so you don't have to load different papers into it. But the sandpaper is a little bit less expensive, and it works very quickly. All right, that looks pretty decent. Didn't require that much work at all. It means it was a good join. So now we're going to go back to the sandpaper and the split mandrel. Make sure that it's loaded correctly, so it should spin nice and even like that. And we'll load in some 600 grit sandpaper. This is one set finer, and bring this up to a nicer surface. The ring will get a little bit warm as you're polishing. That's because you're creating friction with the polishing tool, but not so warm that you shouldn't be able to hold on to it. But if it gets too hot, you're uncomfortable with it, just set it down. Within a couple minutes, it'll be cool again, and you can start right up. But we're done with the 600 grit sandpaper. Now we're going to use a different tool called radials to polish up the inside a little bit more and the outside. Now, we haven't touched the texture at all, because if we use the sandpaper on that, then it would just sand the texture away. We need something flexible, and that's where these radials come in. They're really nice for sanding. They look like this. One by itself is just a little floppy disk like that. But if you stack about 6 of them on a mandrel, then they become a nice brush. They're made of nice sanding material, so it's completely, the whole thing is abrasive, but it's really flexible. When you load it onto a tool called a screw mandrel, which is this little guy, you want to make sure that the points are going to the right. That way, when the tool turns, they'll flex with the tool rather than against the direction and flex away and break off. So make sure that the points are turned to the right. Stack it up on the little screw mandrel like that. And then you can put it onto the mandrel body. And you're ready to use your radial wheels. This is red 220 grit, which is a little coarse for where we're at with this. We've done 600 grit on the inside, and I don't think we really need 220 grit on the surface. So we're going to start with blue 400 grit, and then we'll do peach, which is 6 micron. It's basically 1 level higher. It's starting to make a mirror polish. Green, 1 micron, and this makes a beautiful, lustrous, brilliant finish on the metal. So let's see how they work. The nice thing about all these bits I've been showing you, if you're working at home, is that they're almost completely dust-free. Compared to traditional jewelry polishing materials like rouge and bobbing and tripoli, which leave a huge halo of dust around you while you're working, these are absolutely clean. You want to go slow Give the tool time to rotate against the surface. If you move too quickly, you'll never get a bright shine, even at the final level. Spiral your movement so that you obscure any track marks from the brush, so it doesn't look just like brush marks all over it. And then apply pressure. You should see the bristles are flexing as I work. I'm going to stop for a second so you can see. See how they press in? So you want to apply enough pressure that you're actually pressing into the metal as you polish. You're using this kind of potato peeler motion that's bringing the tool always towards you. Never go off the far edge because it'll try to wrap the tool around and to the other side. Now, just because I've showed you a little bit of how to use a flex shaft, I want to warn you not to try to polish chain or anything loose until you have training, because those can wrap around the tool and can cause harm. So until you get proper training, just avoid loose stuff like chain. That's looking nice. We're not going to do the inside because we already did that up to 600 grit, and this is 400 grit equivalent. So now we are going to switch to the peach one. And bring it up another notch. If you've done a good job on the previous level, the next one goes faster, because each radial is made to remove the marks from the wheel before it. So the first one will take you a while. You want to be thorough. You want to make sure that you're getting rid of any fire scale that you might see. Those will look like little coppery or gray blotches in the silver. And that you're removing any visible scratches, of course. The next level, as you go up in grit, you're basically just trying to get rid of the lines from the previous wheel. So in that respect, to get rid of the lines from the previous wheel, it's good to change directions and go across the previous lines. It makes it easier for you to see when they disappear. Now, we haven't done the sides at all. We can do those pretty quickly as well. We can back up one step and use the split mandrel. You actually have a few choices of tools to use. I like the split mandrel, so it does the sides pretty quickly. But you could also use the silicone polishing wheels for this step. I'm using the 600 grit paper. And you can see that there's very little surface area, so pretty quickly you can bring it up almost to a mirror shine, even with 600 grit. Now I'm going to repeat the same basic steps to polish the half-round gold-filled ring. Of course, the first ring that we made in Project 1 would be exactly the same. I'm just going to flatten this out a little bit first. And this time we'll start with the black silicone wheel to clean up the joint on the inside. When you do too good a job, it's hard to find. Ah, there it is, okay. When you're working on sanding and polishing gold filled, less is more, because you don't have a lot of gold to polish. So just the minimum amount to get rid of the joint and any little bit of extra solder there. And then I'll do a little bit of touch up here, just to get rid of any little bit of extra solder that flowed outside the joint. And the inside of the ring is looking so good that I'm going to jump up to the 600 grit paper and skip the 320 grit. Now, if you're doing the sterling ring, you might have more fire scale to deal with. So if you try this, you might have to just backtrack a step and go back to the 320 grit. There's the last finish on that ring, and we'll be able to put them together and then flare the second side so they can't come apart. So we'll bring it back to the steel block. We're going to need our brass mallet again and one of our dapping punches. I'm going to set that down there and start flaring the second side. You want to make sure that the ring can't slip over. So it just depends on how much you want to flare it from that point. So you can do more. Rotate the ring a little bit, do some more. And you can repeat on the other side. Now you have a revolving ring with a sterling base and a gold-filled center. I hope you enjoyed this project and that you enjoyed learning how to make rings and how to solder.
For more information about the supplies and techniques used, visit jewelschool.com.
I really hope that you enjoy your new rings. Now that you know how to solder, your only limit is your passion and creativity. You might want to try learning some more metalsmithing skills now. For example, you might want to take your soldering and make another ring, only a more elaborate design. You might want to learn how to do stone setting, which also involves soldering. Or you might even want to tackle a bracelet. Whatever you do, keep practicing, keep honing your craft, and we'll see you next time in Jewel School.